In terms of Spanish exploration, this is where we left off. They were a bit less organized than Portugal, but they're going to stumble upon a lot of success, specifically when Columbus finds the Americas. So they were willing to fund a voyage to the New World, and they're going to fund Christopher Columbus, who had been looking for people to sponsor his voyage, where he wanted to sail west to the Indies. You can watch that video later if you want. We left off here actually talking about the Treaty of Tordesillas, where they tried to solve a dispute between what territories would belong to Spain and which one would belong to Portugal. And the Pope is actually going to be involved in making this decision. And it's interesting because none of the other European nations really cared about this decision, but what it does is it sets boundaries for what territories Spain can have control of and what territories Portugal can have control of. And I just want to go to the map that you can see. So what's interesting is you'll notice that Portugal is pretty much given the territory to the east of this line, to the right side of this line, meaning they're given Brazil and then most of Africa and the Indian Ocean. And then Spain is given the territory to the left of this line. And I wish I used a different map, because what you don't see is regions like the Philippines that also belong to the Spanish. So they're going to settle in the Philippines. But this line, what it shows is it shows the European belief that this land was theirs for the taking. Because if you think of all the other regions where this map involves, they already had people living there, governments established there, religions established there. So it's interesting to see this perspective and how even the Christian church, Catholic Church, is involved in basically drawing out a map for territories that Spain and Portugal can take over. Spain and Portugal are the only regions to honor this map, and sometimes they didn't even do that. But all the other European nations and nations in Africa and Asia and the Americas, they did not really care for this map at all. They didn't abide by it. You watched a really good video on the Columbian Exchange, so I hope you remember that. We talked about how in the video they showed the big exchange between environmental goods, technologies, diseases, and how it affected not only the people of both regions, but environments of both regions. So the Columbian Exchange is named after Columbus for his initial voyage. He wasn't necessarily credited with all of the exchanges, but he did bring some of the initial livestock that was brought to the Americas, and then he brought back some of the initial goods that were goods that were brought to Europe. So a couple of things that you guys need to know, especially for the AP test and the SOL, is that in terms of things brought from America to Eurasia, you'll see mostly agricultural products like corn, beans, potatoes, cocoa, tobacco, silver, and gold. And some of those are cash crops, and some of those are just crops that are going to help the health and the livelihood of Europeans. So including things like potatoes, which are very nutritious, you'll see they grow very well in Europe. And that's good because they were running out of agricultural products that could be used to support their population. So we actually see a population growth in Europe. And then from Europe or Eurasia to America, we see them bringing over wheat, sugar, rice, coffee. Specifically livestock is the big one, horses, cattle, and pigs. And you can see how that even alters the environment because of the grazing that's going to happen. And then finally, disease, which we'll talk about later. It wipes out a large number of the population in the Americas. So this is a good map just for you to study so you can see the transition of products with the Columbian Exchange. It's just that two-way exchange. Again, some of the products that Europe had and brought over to the Americas, they had been taken from parts of Africa and Asia. So it's not necessarily just Europe. It's a worldwide trade network. And then later on in the unit, we're going to add in an extra line here or an extra arrow. We're going to show all the goods coming from the Americas going to Europe, but then we're going to show those goods going from Europe to Africa and how then Africa is going to have slaves exported being sent to the Americas. So for now, it's just this two-way exchange, and then later on, we're going to see more of a three-way exchange happening with those goods and people. So here are some quotes about why the Columbian Exchange is so significant. Maybe look over these. It'll help you since you're going to be writing your essay on the Columbian Exchange on your test. These are just important quotes about how, while it was negative, because we know a lot of people died because of Columbus, it actually had an influence worldwide, and it's cool. It's one of the first worldwide exchanges that we ever see in world history. With the Columbian Exchange, we see an emergence of new social classes and destruction of old social classes, both in Europe and in the Americas. So both of their social structures are changed. New lifestyles, some are healthier, such as in Europe. We see people becoming healthier, lifespans become longer, and we see new diversity of crops that benefits them nutritionally. And the European domesticated horses and cattle are going to change the lifestyles of American Indians, not even necessarily on the negative side. I know a lot of students tell me when they picture Native Americans, they picture them on horseback. And so the way that happened was with the Columbian Exchange by bringing horses into the Americas. One of the negative side effects is a system of coerced labor or forced labor. And we're going to see this because some of the main crops that grew very well in the Americas were sugar and tobacco. And with sugar and tobacco, you're going to have huge farms called plantations form. And the Europeans, not only did they not have the numbers for those farms, but they almost didn't have the lifestyle technique for it. In Europe at this time, a workday typically lasted 4 hours. So they didn't even know or want to put in that work effort into these plantations. So you'll see a lot of indigenous people being used to farm, a lot of Native Americans being used to farm. And then once that population started to dwindle because of disease and overworking, that's when we start to see slavery begin, where we see Africans being exported from Africa and being sent over to the colonies and to these huge plantations. And we're going to talk more about the effect of that later on in the unit. We'll spend like a whole 2 days talking about that because it's important. And then in terms of environmental impact, we're going to see that a lot of the animals brought over grazing the land is going to be negative, and then the plantation systems are really going to destroy all of the indigenous economies that had already been used. They're going to over-farm, they're going to change the land, you're going to see a lot of deforestation, and overall just a damage to the environment. Their next goal in terms of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, not Portugal so much, but more Spain, is to try to find a route from ocean to ocean and to try to cut through the Americas to make it to Asia. And as you guys know, there's going to be land that whole way unless you go under South America. So in 1513, Balboa is going to cross Panama, and Panama is pretty thin, so it allows him to get into the Pacific Ocean. So he's the first European to see the Pacific Ocean, but he's not going to continue going through the Pacific Ocean and make it all the way back to Europe. And the person who's going to be successful in doing that in 1519 is named Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan is famous for being the first sailor or Spanish explorer to circumnavigate the globe or sail around the entire globe, sail around the world. And you can see his route goes pretty much under South America, back around, and then through the Pacific, through Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, and then around Africa to get back to Spain. Unfortunately, what a lot of people don't know is that he did not circumnavigate the globe because he did not make it. Only his crew did. He lands on an island near the Philippines, and he thinks that the people there are going to treat him and his people like the Native Americans did. So he steps off his ship with a bunch of men, and they start walking towards an island, and they are greeted with a barrage of spears and and arrows, and he is struck there and he dies. So he actually dies like in the Philippines. That's my dog barking. So he actually dies in the Philippines, and he doesn't make it, but his crew makes it. So they give him the credit for circumnavigating the globe. So here are some routes that you can see of all the explorers. And you should have mapped this on one of your homework assignments, so you should have this. But you can see where Magellan lands in the Philippines. In terms of the next goal for the Spaniards, it's less to explore the Americas and more to conquer the Americas. So they move a bit away from colonizing Asia, and they start thinking of, hey, we have this new land. There's a lot of good resources, so why don't we just completely conquer that territory? So now we move on from European exploration more to European invasion. And we call these invaders conquistadors. It means to conquer. So we see these early Spanish adventurers, and eventually they're going to conquer the big Native American tribes that are in Mesoamerica and Peru. They're going to bring on disaster in terms of their military feats. They're going to completely conquer and topple these really important cities that we've talked about. And we're going to see that disease is going to wipe out a huge amount of these Native Americans. So the first major conquistador was Hernan Cortez. He is going to be exploring places like Hispaniola and Cuba, and then he gets permission from the Spanish king to conquer Central America, specifically Mexico. And his goal is to take out the Aztec Empire. So he's the Spanish explorer and conquistador who conquers Moctezuma and the Aztecs of Mexico in 1519 to 1521. It was not easy. They are going to try to make treaties with him, and he is not going to listen to them. He's going to go in and take them pretty forcefully. And the way he does that is he makes alliances with other native tribes that are in the region who don't like the Aztecs because the Aztecs were fierce. And he is going to successfully conquer the Aztec Empire in Mexico. And he's going to topple their city. He's going to rename it Mexico City. And he's going to become the first governor of what he calls New Spain. So he takes the whole region and calls it New Spain. And he's going to be governor from about 1521 to 1524. The next conquistador is named Francisco Pizarro, and he is sent to take out the Native Americans in Peru. And there are legends that Peru is filled with gold and silver, and it's just a bountiful resource that they don't even know what to do with. So, like, the Inca actually valued things like corn more than they valued silver and gold. So Pizarro's goal is to go and take over the Incas. And he is going to lead the conquest. And what he does is the Incans are actually going to invite him to dinners and try to make alliances with him. And so he goes to one of these meetings, and the leader of the Incan Empire, Atahualpa, he's going to take him hostage and accuse him of all these crimes and end up executing him. And we start to see that it becomes easy at that point for them to go into both Cusco, and they're going to go into Lima, Peru, and they're going to take out both of those cities, and they're going to topple the Incan Empire and the whole Incan government. Later on, what's interesting is Pizarro kind of gets revenge. One of his commanders is going to start questioning him, and so he's going to have that commander executed. But then the son of that commander is going to want revenge on Pizarro, so he comes and he assassinates Pizarro. So Pizarro never really gets to rule over Peru because he almost became too ambitious, and one of his own men is going to take him out. But these are the regions that we see taken over by the Spaniards, and they're going to use these regions to benefit them later on. And we see empires like the Aztec and Inca falling primarily because of disease. So these are some images of Cortez and Pizarro interacting with the Native Americans. And some of the Native Americans even thought they were gods sent down from the heavens. And you can see that even because they were wearing shiny armor and the sun was beaming off of their armor. They almost thought that they were related to. So you can watch that video later on if you want. In terms of effects on Native Americans, the biggest effect is the decimation of their population or decline in their population because of disease, specifically smallpox. So you can see on this map here how the population of Mexico goes from about 25 million to about 1 million in the years that the Spaniards are really going to be there and be influencing their regions. And the reason this happened is they did not have the immunities that the Europeans had. But the Europeans brought over these germs, and the Native Americans, I think the video even said, some of them got sick and died without ever meeting a European just because of how easily and quickly the disease is spread. And most historians think that an estimated 80 to 90% of Native Americans died purely from disease. So when you think of this decimation of the population in the Americas, I don't want you to think that the Europeans savagely went and killed by sword or by gun, killed 90% of the population, but 90% are going to end up dying because of disease that was brought over by Europeans. So this is a famous painting that was done of a smallpox patient in Native America. In terms of exploring North America, we're going to talk more about it when we talk about when they were colonized and how they were colonized. But some similarities with the Spanish: they're looking for wealth sources, and they're looking for great indigenous empires that they can take over and build off of that success. They respond to the native people with a mixture of diplomacy and violence. And you're going to see, even like you've heard of John Smith with Pocahontas, you're going to see a mixture of diplomacy and violence from both groups, from the natives and the Europeans. And then we're going to see African slavery being brought into the Americas and being used during colonization. In terms of differences, they started off exploration in their expeditions through privateering. And privateering is a fancy word for pirating. They think they're going to be more successful stealing from Spanish ships than they are going to be just going and trying to find gold for themselves. Because the Spanish are coming back to Europe with ships just filled with gold and silver that they're getting from their territories. And so the English say, why don't we just exploit that and start pirating their ships? So even Queen Elizabeth is going to start sending out privateers to get these Spanish ships to try to exploit their gold and bring it back to England. And her famous sailor was called Francis Drake, and his nickname amongst the Spanish is going to be El Drake, and they kind of watch out for him. In England and France, they're not going to set up these huge colonial bureaucracies like we see the Spanish do. It's going to be smaller scale, and it's going to take longer to form. So New Spain is going to explode and become this huge colonial shift. Whereas in the Americas, it takes a little bit longer for them to get settled in. Especially the French really just send their first few explorers to start fur trapping in Canada. And then eventually it's going to get a little bit bigger from there. Both of them, specifically England, is going to start private companies or joint stock companies where individuals are going to pool money together to lead these expeditions. We didn't really see that happening with Spain because Spain, their monarchs were the ones sending them. They had much greater autonomy from their home countries and stronger political involvement than the Latin American colonies. For example, the Latin American colonies are pretty much told by the Spanish crown what to do, whereas in the Americas, they're a little more independent, and we see different types of colonies form. Like you guys know, you've heard of Plymouth Rock, which was very, very different than Jamestown. We're going to see a lot of difference in those. And then in terms of more English and French explorers, we start looking at their explorers, even if you go back in time closer to Columbus. England is going to send out a man named John Cabot, who's going to sail to Newfoundland. And he's going to start exploring Newfoundland and the Chesapeake Bay, and he's going to claim some lands south of there for England. One of the most famous explorers from France that you do need to know for the SOL is named Jacques Cartier. And Jacques Cartier is famous for sailing into Canada, sailing down the St. Lawrence River, and claiming parts of Canada for the French. And that's going to give them access to a lot of fur trading. And they're going to eventually start competing with the English colonies in North America. And that's where we see almost like the French and Indian War sparking, is the competition between those two colonies. And then finally, Queen Elizabeth's favorite privateer, Francis Drake, she's going to send him out on even more missions other than privateering. And from 1577 to 1580, England is going to be the second nation to circumnavigate the globe, and Francis Drake is going to lead that expedition. And unlike Magellan, he actually himself makes it back to England. And again, that's going to be chartered by Queen Elizabeth herself. So when looking at what's going to be next and we're going to talk about this more in Unit 4, Part 2, we're going to see a commercial revolution where we see a shift away from, there's a typo, a small-scale bartering system and more to a large-scale international trade. And with that, we see things like developments of colonies, new social classes, both in the Americas and in Europe, new ocean trade routes, population growth, inflation, formation of joint stock companies, and the creation of the Atlantic slave trade. And just to break these down to introduce them to you, in terms of colonization, we're going to be looking at how European nations not only settle in the new regions, but they're going to try to establish control over the indigenous people and the indigenous environments. And then a new concept that you have to really, really get a grasp of, so we'll talk about it a lot, is mercantilism. Think of a mercantilism. It's an economic system where you want to focus on your exports. And the European nations are going to be focusing on their exports from the colonies. And what they want to do is they want the exports from the colonies to benefit the mother country as much as possible. So let's say you're looking at Mexico. Any export that comes from Mexico, it's mostly to make Spain wealthy. Not necessarily to make Mexico wealthy, but more to make Spain wealthy. And so we're even going to see these nations even force people to buy the exports that are coming from the Americas. For example, England, one of their exports was tobacco. The kings and queens of England, you're going to see them forcing smoking on people so that people are smoking tobacco and using the export so that they can make the money. And then we're going to see joint stock companies, which are business ventures backed by the government, but not necessarily funded by them, where people work together and sell shares to fund the expeditions so that they have those happening constantly. And in terms of the bigger picture for this unit, or for this section, we're going to see Western Europe's economic and military power increase, which we hadn't really seen. They were almost going through dark ages before this. As countries and regions come under European influence, East Asian countries are going to isolate themselves, places like China and Japan. And as undiscovered lands continue to be explored, we'll see new social, political, environmental, cultural, and economic impacts on both the regions that sent out explorers and the regions that are being explored. So just new spice categories happening in both of those regions. Okay, so if you have any questions about this, we can talk about it when I see you guys next time. And enjoy maybe another snow day, and if not, I'll see you guys tomorrow.